going to read? Okay, perfect. Hello, everyone. I'm Arash Manon. I'm a board member of the Twin Cities Iranian Culture Collective. This talk is presented as part of the 2020 Twin Cities Culture Festival. The festival is produced by the Twin Cities Iranian Culture Collective, a non-political and non-religious non-profit made of local Iranian and non-Iranian Americans with the purpose of presenting Iranian culture to build a bridge for better understanding among communities. You can visit the festival website at www.twincitiesiranianculturefestival.com to find out more about all our activities and to view recordings of several other talks that we had and the concerts that we had, plus virtual art and photo galleries, a virtual tea house, and more. You can find more information on our website. And now, Jeremy Eggers will introduce our speaker for the day.
Well, we have the great honor of having as our guest Juan Cole, the Richard P. Mitchell Collegiate Professor of History at the University of Michigan. Professor Cole is best known in the academic world as a leading expert on Egypt, on Shia Islam, and on the modern history of the Middle East. He's written a number of books with titles like Engaging the Muslim World, Napoleon's Egypt, Invading the Middle East, and Sacred Space and Holy War, The Politics, Culture, and History of Shiite Islam. But among the broader public, he's best known probably as the creator of the website Informed Comment. It's sometimes referred to as a blog, but it's really more than that. It's a news and commentary site that Professor Cole contributes to, as well as a number of other people. At any rate, welcome, Juan Cole. Thanks for joining us. My understanding is that you were going to read a poem or two, and then we were going to have a little conversation. I was going to ask you a few questions. Is that?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought, well, since I got knocked out of doing the poetry reading at the indie bookstore, that I'll do it with you all. Jeremy suggested maybe a variety of readings here. Let me start with just so that the Americans in the audience can hear the cadence of the original. This is a poem attributed to Omar Khayyam, who was a 12th century astronomer, and a great astronomer and great mathematician in Isfahan and Merv. This poetry grew up, I think, probably after his death, but was attributed to him. He is kind of what the literary people call a frame author, because he was a scientist. And the poetry exhibits this kind of skeptical view of the world. So this poem goes this way. Emruz ke nobet javani man ast, me nusham az on ke kamrani man ast. Ebash makonid agarche talch ast, khosh ast. Talch ast az on ke zindagani man ast. So this is in the form of what is called a rubai, and the plural is Rubáiyát, a quatrain. Technically it is 2 lines with 4 hemistitches. And it's a very simple form of poetry, but deceptively simple. And much beloved all throughout Iranian history since it was first invented in the medieval period. This poem, which I translated in my book, says that he's enjoying his youth, and as part of his youth, he's drinking. And in Muslim societies of the medieval period, it was considered morally wrong to drink alcohol, but he's boasting of it. And he's also admitting that the wine is bitter. And, you know, wine is a little bitter. Of course, it has grades, and the technical terms about bitterness are there in wine in wine specialized vocabulary. So he admits that it's bitter, but he says, even so, it's part of his life, it's part of his youth. And I thought this poem exemplifies many of the themes in this corpus of poetry. It's celebrating life on the one hand, because he's young, but then it's also acting out, defying convention, boasting about drinking wine. And then it shows a realization that even those things we enjoy in this life are imperfect and are a source of sorrow and grief. So the poetry is, I think, philosophically very profound, and it's been compared to existentialism in the sense that it's saying that there's no point in putting your eggs in the basket of the afterlife. Who knows whether there is any? We should try to be here now and enjoy life as it is. But then there's a further paradox, is that life is often not very enjoyable, and we have to shoulder through. So then let me turn to Edward Fitzgerald, a British gentleman of the mid-19th century from a wealthy family who went to Cambridge and became a gentleman scholar. It's not like he had to work for a living. He liked languages. He learned Spanish and did some translating from Spanish. He knew Greek and Latin, being a Victorian gentleman. He did some work with Greek. But then a friend of his was working in the Bodleian Library in Oxford and discovered this manuscript of Omar Khayyam and brought it back to Fitzgerald, and they were working on Persian together. And they were quite amazed and somewhat disturbed as Victorian gentlemen at the sentiments in this medieval poetry. They hadn't expected Omar Khayyam to be Good Time Charlie. Even Fitzgerald talks about some of the poems as being strong, by which he meant violative of Victorian morality. So ordinarily, you know, this was the height of the British Empire, and they owned India, and they used Persian in their administration. They would be thinking of themselves as less hidebound than the Orientals who were fanatics. This is how they would put it. But then to find a medieval Persian poet who was more outré than they were was something of a shock. But Fitzgerald translated this poetry into Victorian English, and he was influenced by the poets of his day, as well as the Romantic and early modern poets. He was influenced by Shakespeare, and he used a language sometimes that was a little Latin, a little bit complicated, a little bit archaic. So here's one of his poems. I think the vessel that with fugitive articulation answered once did live, and drink, and that impassive lip I kissed, how many kisses might it take and give? I think it's a little hard for contemporaries to understand this poem. And what he's saying is that he has a clay cup that he's drinking wine out of. And the convention in this poetry is that we're all going to die and will be pounded into clay in the earth. And then somebody in the future is going to come along and make a clay cup out of us and drink wine out of it. So the clay cup is a symbol of our mortality. And so that's the vessel. And he's saying it once did live. When you're kissing a dead person's lips when you drink the wine, is what the poem is saying. But I think it's configured by Fitzgerald with all of these Latin words and in a very complicated style. That particular one, I mean, I'm not knocking Fitzgerald as a poet. I think many of his renderings are very beautiful. But that particular one stood out to me for having some of the defects that I was trying to repair when I decided to try to translate the poetry for my contemporaries, just as Fitzgerald was translating for his. So if you don't mind, I'll just read a few of my own now. And
Please, please.
In monasteries, temples, and retreats, they fear hellfire and look for paradise. But those who know the mysteries of God don't let those seeds be planted in their hearts. Deep in my dream, I heard a sage cry out, "What joy has slumber ever caused to bloom? Why do a thing that looks so much like death? Go drinking. Lifetime soon will pass in sleep." If an earthly angel offered me a cup of wine, as we two sat along the riverbank in spring, I'd be worse than any dog, pardon my language, if I ever thought again about the paradise above. You cannot pierce the veil of mystery or grasp this strange arrangement of the world. You do not have a home save in black earth. Start drinking, since this story isn't short. The moving pen ignores the good and bad, since long ago it sketched the universe, decreeing what would be before all time. Our efforts cannot strike a single line. I'm lolling with a stunning beauty and some friends in springtime on a grassy riverbank. So pass around the wine, since morning drunks are independent of both mosque and church.
I'm just curious, I didn't read every last one of your translations, but I looked for something that sounded at all like a loaf of bread, a jug of wine, and thou.
Yeah.
And I wondered how.
I did translate that one. I'm not sure I can find it really quickly.
Well, that's okay. I mean, if
it's there. Here it is. This is the way I did it. A book of poetry, some ruby wine, and you, and half a loaf of bread. I don't need any more. When you and I are curled up in the great outdoors, our bliss outshines the glories of an emperor.
Beautiful. So let me ask you, how did you first become interested in Omar Khayyam, or the poems that were not written by Omar Khayyam?
The poems attributed to him. Well, my generation grew up on the Fitzgerald translation, and we were often given a few of them, at least in school. And that had been common all through the 20th century. The Fitzgerald's translation of the Rubáiyát was adopted by teachers, high school teachers, I think in particular, as a badge of education. And so I think they felt as though if they could only get the kids to read some of this poetry, they'd be more educated. Because sort of like they gave that essay by Ralph Waldo Emerson on self-reliance. I think it was a kind of a virtue that the American teachers wanted to instill of skeptical thinking. And the poetry is full of that. Everybody encountered it in school. T.S. Eliot, and there's hardly any figure in American and British letters of the 20th century who wasn't deeply influenced by this poetry. And in fact, the love song of Alfred J. Prufrock has kind of paraphrases of Fitzgerald in it. So it inspired the poets. And so I encountered, like everybody else did, it was just taught to me. And then I, got my own copy. And somehow in the 1970s, I think there was a revolt against teaching only dead white men. And Fitzgerald was coded as a dead white man. And so I think they stopped teaching him in favor of teaching, world literature and so forth, which is a little bit ironic because he was translating
Khayyam was not a dead white man.
Yeah. But in any case, he got dropped from the curriculum. So now there's a big divide. When I bring up with people that I have translated this poetry, people my age and older will often quote back to me Fitzgerald. They have memorized some of it. And people younger than I'm in my late 60s, I have never heard of it. So there's clearly a kind of cutoff point when the high school teacher stopped teaching it. And then in 1976, I went to Iran, and I had already been studying Persian. And I got myself a little Persian book of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam with this garish Bollywood-style cover with the man in the turban with the wine jug and this half-clothed woman. This was before the revolution. On the cover, and so I bought that and began working through it in my still embryonic Persian, and I loved the poetry. And I also compared it to Fitzgerald, and I thought there were moments which Fitzgerald didn't give the poetry its due. That the poetry was often a little bit more profound than he was representing it.
And you did say how Khayyam was discovered by Fitzgerald. Can you say a little bit more about why it captured the imagination of Victorians? Or
yeah, I'm trying to write a book about that. It's this poetry, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, we would now say it went viral. It became enormously popular and influential. And beginning in the late 19th century, one book I read said that by 1900, there was a new printing of the book every single day of the year in the United States. And at some point, and people kept wanting the newest printing. Houghton Mifflin, the publisher, amounted to anything because of this book. Basically, they pirated Fitzgerald's translation. They declared it out of copyright because I don't know. I think it was common in that era, in the late 19th century, for the United States publishers just to steal things from Britain. But they declared it was out of copyright. And so they issued it. And then they found illustrators like Edmund Dulac to illustrate it. And so those illustrations made the book sell even better. And people would give it as gifts. They say writers in the early 20th century got tired of Christmas because all their relatives, knowing that they were a writer, brought them the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Young men studied it before they went on a date, would often show up with it under their arms, and they would go for a picnic, like the poem says, with some wine and outside, and romance the girl by reading her the Rubaiyat. So it was a cultural phenomenon. The Mardi Gras of 1905 in New Orleans was Omar Khayyam themed, and the floats all had Persians on them, and wine drinking and women belly dancing. And why the Victorians took to it, and the Edwardians as well, in such a massive way is a good question. So I think it may be different in Britain and in the United States. But in Britain, I think it was an aid to self-secularization. I think the poetry was read as skeptical of conventional religion. Because it says, don't count on heaven and hell, guys.
And given that it was read as how did you put that? A skeptical take on religion?
Yeah, an aid to self-secularization. People were reading it to find their way forward in a secularizing world.
Well, that makes me curious, and I hadn't thought of this question before, but you mentioned that your background is the shrine of Omar Khayyam in Nishapur, and that makes me wonder, with all the references to drinking wine and other low-life activities, how is Khayyam received these days in the Islamic Republic?
Well, of course, the clerics do not like the poetry, and I think in 2009, they tried to issue a law banning it, but people have memorized it, and they say it at Iranians in Iran have secret parties, so they'll bring out these verses for that purpose. And now there's the internet; you can't ban poetry, so it's disapproved by the establishment, but it's loved by the people.
Now, I know that Iran isn't a party to the copyright conventions, which makes me wonder whether copies of your book are circulating in Iran, or whether you've gotten any feedback. I guess it wouldn't necessarily from Iranians in or outside of Iran about your translation.
Well, the translation, of course, is just of Persian poetry, so they already have that. But the introduction and I have a long piece at the end of the book, sort of laying out where I think the poetry came from originally and what it meant in its original setting. Iran may well translate that and publish it, and they're welcome to. They translated my book about Muhammad last year, and I'm glad of it. I'm glad to have an Iranian audience. I think the book, my thesis will be a little bit hard for some Iranians to accept because, first of all, they really believe that Omar Khayyam wrote this poetry. And I, historically speaking, I don't think that's very likely. You know, we have a book of biographies by a man who knew Khayyam and who wrote a little bit about Khayyam. And there's nothing in this book about him writing poetry, much less scandalous poetry. So this is an allegation that comes after his death and from people who didn't know him. And then the poetry grows through the centuries. So it starts, you know, there are 50 in the 1200s and there are 150 and then and by the time you get to the 19th century in Lucknow in India, where people read Persian, there's a book of 1,000 quatrains attributed to Khayyam. So he was very busy after his death.
Especially after his death. I meant to do this before, but this is the book. And the publisher is IB Taurus. I'm sure your local bookstore, your local independent bookstore can order it for you. Otherwise, it's available on Amazon. And I believe it's available through the publisher. Maybe we can post a link to that.
Yeah.
Cynthia has already posted links to that. Well, that's great. Look in the chat. The poems are delightful to read. The other thing I was going to ask you is, I think you've said that the poems seem especially timely today, or in our present circumstances. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, because we're in a very strange moment of COVID-19 and problems of inequality in this country and prejudice. And the poetry does occasionally address those kinds of things, but I think it addresses the existential condition of human beings that it complains. We don't know where we came from. We don't know where we're going. Life seems awfully unjust. And the poetry attacks astrology at a number of points for trying to kind of put people in a cage, right? That astrology is saying your fate is determined by the stars before you're even born and so forth. And in keeping with the persona of Omar Khayyam as an astronomer, he knows that this is nonsense. So he says, don't blame the stars for your fate. He says the stars are 1,000 times more helpless than you are. This is true because, you know, Mars, for instance, is just a big block of ferrous stone, and we know exactly where it's going to be next year at this precise moment. We can calculate it. We don't know where any of us are going to be next year at this precise moment. Human beings are like 1 billion times more complex than a star.
Makes sense. Let me see. Well, those were the questions that I had. I think we We may have some questions from our audience. Oh, somebody, Mahdi has raised his hand. Cynthia, can you?
I'm going to let him to speak. So just a second.
Oh, I'm sorry, you're doing it.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
We can hear you.
Yeah. Hi to everyone, and thank you for the great presentation about Khayyam. I have a couple of questions, but I'll just ask one question, and then if other people ask their question, I'll probably ask another one. Do I pronounce your name correctly? Is it Juan?
Juan like
Juan.
the Spanish.
Oh, Juan. Juan, last year at the same time, I, with my friend Dan Rain, who could be one of the people who are watching us, presented our translation of Khayyam, which we did together. I'm an Iranian and he was the American, so we worked on that together. And I want to ask you a question that I had at that time and see what your approach was to it. That when you were translating, I was always thinking that this book has been translated multiple times from very different perspectives. And what can we do which is different than other people? I was reading a book that was written like 50 years ago. It's a Persian book. And the author says that by that time, there were like more than 50 translations into English. So I want to know what your experience was. Did you have the same question that why are you doing this after all these things, or what? Or you thought something was not enough, or you wanted to add that perspective to that? I want to hear that if you ever asked that questions, because we were always asking that questions that should we really publish it or not?
Right. Well, I understand it. And Mehdi, I haven't seen your translation. I'd love to see it.
Thank you.
This poetry has been much translated. I think 50 is a vast underestimate. What I would say about my translation is that it came out of my scholarship. And so it is a translation of the Bodleian manuscript, the one that was found that Fitzgerald first used. And it was found by Edward Cowell, and it had been collected by the first British diplomatic mission to modern Iran, which went out in 1810. Sir Gore Ouseley was the first British ambassador to Iran in modern times. So he or his brother William collected this manuscript, which is dated 1460 of the Common Era. It was produced in Shiraz. It says, the colophon says it was written out by a man named Mahmoud Yerbaki, who's obviously a Turkmen, in the city of Shiraz. I was in the capital of Shiraz. I was very confused. I know a lot about Iranian history, but I couldn't think in 1460 what was Shiraz the capital of.
Poetry. I'm from Shiraz.
Are you? Yeah. Well, capital of poetry is true. But it happens that at the time the Karakoyunlu dynasty of Turkmen was ruling Iran, and that was based in Tabriz. Jahan Shah was the king. His son rebelled against him briefly, and named Pir Budak. And he established a little statelet with Shiraz as his capital for a few years. And the poetry was collected there. And so this manuscript comes from that moment. And, you know, the Turkmen were famous that they liked to have parties and dancing girls. And I think they were enjoying this poetry as part of their lifestyle. They were not Orthodox people. So I wanted to translate the whole Bodleian manuscript as a piece to kind of be faithful to Yerbudaki's vision of the poetry, because there are many collections of this poetry, and many of the collections were made in India, where I think also a lot of the poetry was produced in later centuries. by people who, used Khayyam as their pen name. This book had only been translated once as a whole by Edward Heron Allen in 1898. And he did it as a very kind of dry, scholarly enterprise. So I wanted to put the poetry into modern English verse, a contemporary English verse. I grew up being influenced, by Ferlinghetti and the Beats and free verse. And so I did a lot of the poetry, although my editor made me keep a 4-line structure to make it quatrains. A lot of my translations are free verse. And that's the way most contemporary American poets write poetry. So I wanted to see what would the poetry sound like if it were written in this contemporary American way, as contemporary American poetry.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you so much for all the answer and all the work that you have done.
Thank you.
Okay, Farjan.
Yes, thank you so much for taking my my question. Dr. Cole, I was wondering if you say that this was not actually written by Khayyam, was he at all influential in the way that the Persians thought at the time? So in other words, was he influential culturally other than his work as an astronomer and mathematician?
No. As far as I can tell, he was a great astronomer and mathematician. When I was in 10th grade, I had a geometry course, and they taught us to do some algebraic geometry where you solve algebra problems by putting them in the form of geometry. Sometimes you can see things more clearly that way. He invented that. Khayyam, in the annals of the history of science, is a giant. I mentioned his friend Nizami Aruzi, who wrote a book called Chahar Maghale, 4 essays, which is full of kind of anecdotes of people whom he knew personally. And Khayyam was his teacher. He mentions Khayyam a couple of times in that book. And there's nothing, humanistic or belletrist about those mentions. And there's no evidence we historians like to use the primary sources. So the closer you can get to the time of the person that you're studying with a source, the happier we are. So it's not until decades after Khayyam's death that people start saying, oh, this poem is by Khayyam. And one of the earliest ones that's attributed to him is also attributed to other poets. I think there was, medieval Persian poetry, a lot of it is anonymous. We think about the great poets we know, like Hafez and so forth, who are known authors. But if you look and there's there are collections of poetry, and often the editors who include a poem that they like, they will say, in Arabic, they'll say, la'arifu man alafahu. I don't know who composed it. And a lot of the poems that Yer Budaki said that Khayyam wrote appear in earlier anthologies in that form as author unknown. So it's very suspicious to a historian that in 1460 we know who wrote them, but we hadn't known that in 1250.
But Dr. Cole, would it be fair to say that given that all the poems have the same mood, they sort of create the same world, or that they were all written by one person?
Yeah, so this is one of the problems, Farjan, you put your finger on it, that actually the collections of poetry attributed to Omar Khayyam don't all have the same mood. And so some of the poetry that is attributed to him is very Sufi. And one of the poems mentions Qalandars, or the wandering Sufis. Other poems seem to be very skeptical. We don't know why we were sent here. Since we don't know why we were sent here, we might as well drink wine and chase lovers. So that's not a very Sufi sentiment, but it coexists in these collections attributed to Khayyam. And it was very puzzling to the Victorians. So in Fitzgerald's collection, there are both kinds of poems. And then there was a French scholar who I think knew of Fitzgerald's translation and who translated several hundred poems attributed to Khayyam in Qajar, Iran. He was a French diplomat in Tehran, and he was helped by a Qajar official named Garoussi. And he has a preface to this translation, which he says, these are all Sufi poems. They're all mystical. The wine doesn't mean wine, it means spiritual ecstasy. And if you read the poetry, sometimes that's true. Sometimes it can't possibly be true. Sometimes he's obviously talking about a real lover and real wine. So the fact that all of these are mixed up together, and then the vocabulary is different. So sometimes he calls, he talks about kharabat, which is the medieval Persian word for a wine house. And it's called kharabat because they used to put the wine houses at the outside the city, you know, in kind of run down areas where the Armenians would live or so forth. It was kind of slummy. They were like the French, you know, that they put the slums on the outside of the city. So some of the poetry talks about going to the kharabat, to the ruins, which means the tavern. But then other poems call it a mekhaneh, which is a different kind of vision of the wine house. So you know, I think there's a lot of evidence in the poetry that it's not by one author, and you know, the voice of the poetry is often very lower class. So it talks about a man who's in a bar, in a tavern drinking, and he's had to pawn his winter coat, and it's winter, and he's complaining that the stove in the tavern has broken down, so he's just shivering. But on the other hand, he's got his wine, so he's really happy about that. Well, you know, the real Khayyam was given 10,000 dinars a year by the Sultan, and he would have been wearing silk and living in palaces, and he wasn't drinking in kharabat in ruins and having pawned his cloak.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
I have another question, and it may be based on a false premise, but you've already said something about the cultural relevance of Omar Khayyam to our present situation. My impression is that two other Iranian poets have really sort of had their cultural moment in the last few decades in the United States, Hafez and Rumi, both probably thanks to translators who sort of omitted a lot of their cultural context and their Muslim identities. But is there, do you have an explanation of why them, and or maybe it's Omar Khayyam's turn now, but do you have any thoughts on that?
From your lips to God's ears. Well, so with regard to Rumi, I just think it's the genius of Coleman Barks. He collaborated with Persian knowing poets, and also he used Nicholson's early 20th century literal translation as his guide. And he focused in on Rumi's lyric poetry, which, you know, most of Rumi's poetry is didactic. It's narrative, it's stories and anecdotes, which are intended to teach disciples spiritual truths. But the lyrical poetry hadn't been focused on so much. And I think one of the things about mystical lyrical poetry is you can't actually tell the difference between it and love poetry. It so happens that the object of love is God, but it has this deep emotional and deep emotional resonance. So I think that Barks managed to make Rumi's lyric poetry accessible to people, and as you say, he only was able to do that in some ways by denaturing it from its original context, because this was being written in Konya, in what is now Turkey, for Sufi disciples who were Muslims. And so my friend Rosita has written for The Atlantic about how Rumi was accessible to the US public, partly because they, Coleman Barks omitted the Islamic background. I'm luckier in that regard because a lot of the Khayyami poetry really is irreligious, and so Islam doesn't come into it so much occasionally, and I kept it in where it did. But I think the same thing is true of Hafez, who is a lyric poet, and I think his ghazal are addressing people's inner emotions, in an intimate sort of way, their inner feelings. And I think there's just, at the moment, a vogue for lyric poetry. We're in a moment where I wonder whether, stolid prose is really going to address our existential situation. We might need the lyric poets, and the Iranians are some of the best.
Mm.
Okay. We have a question from Adam, so I'm going to read the question. Khayyam was very important to American culture of the 60s and early 70s, but not so much now. Why should we, meaning Americans, care about Khayyam? And what does your translation do to help us connect?
Yeah, so well, for contemporary Americans, I'm saying that there's a rebelliousness in the poetry against the establishment, and that's something that our generation might appreciate. There's also a skepticism, a refusal to take things on say-so, including the verities of Scripture itself. And I think also all of the evidence is that the younger generation in the United States is much more skeptical about those verities than their elders had been. And I think there's also that sense of self-reliance in the poetry, which is, ironically enough, very much associated with Americanness. But I think we're not the only people that have ever wanted to be self-reliant, and even medieval Persian poetry strives for that. And some of the poems that were produced, I think, in medieval Iran or India centuries later, are even more skeptical. And of course, they're not in my book since I was using the Arabudaki version, but Fitzgerald's translation contains some of these impudent poems, which complain that, the universe is not very well arranged, and if I had my way, I'd arrange it differently. Which, I mean, that could get you in trouble with the Muslim clerics saying something like that, because it's kind of a slam on God.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Okay, Maddie has another question, so I'm going to let him too. Okay, Maddie, go ahead.
Thank you again. I'm back for the second question, Juan. My question is, do you see any connection between the political relationship of Iran and the US and the position of Khayyam? Because one reason that I ask this question is that it seems that before the revolution, this character is more well known. And sometimes I can compare his quatrains with like the codes of Lao Tse from China. So they are short, they are strong, but still we see that the culture that penetrated into the US from Tibet or from China is still alive, or people at least know the characters and something about them and what they're bringing. But when you talk about Khayyam, it's just people before 60s and people after 60s. Or do you see any relationship between that maybe the sour political relationship had an effect on decline of Khayyam?
Yeah, well, who knows? It's possible that Iranian culture isn't as valued because Iran is a political enemy. I mean, I guess you'd have to do some opinion polling to see if that's what's going on. But I don't think so. I think Americans have all along made a distinction between culture and politics, and you know, Dante didn't stop being studied when we were fighting Mussolini, and one of the reasons, you know, you asked me earlier why I was bringing out this translation. One of the reasons I'm bringing it out is that I'm hoping that I can get through to maybe some people who wouldn't enjoy Fitzgerald's Victorian version, but might enjoy the poetry as a modern American verse, and rekindle some interest in it among young Americans, so as to impress upon them, you know, that Iran is a great civilization and there's more to it than the current regime. But I don't know, it's possible. I have to tell you that when the Iraq War began, horrible as it was, it occurred to me that there might, in the aftermath, be a vogue for Baghdad culture, that, you know, maybe Mutanabi would attract some attention, or,
Yeah.
you know, that it might spill over in that way. And I was a little bit surprised that it seems not to have happened at all, that the Americans just kind of blocked out Iraqi deep culture from their minds. And now, of course, nobody wants anything to do with Iraq. But I suppose it is also possible something of the same thing is happening with regard to Iran.
Unlike what happened to Japan, I think, because Japan before World War was an evil power, but after that it became a very fancy, delicate culture in the US.
Yeah, and I complain in my book about you know, the big literature on the influence of the haiku on modern American literature, and yet there just is a very small literature on the influence of the Rubáiyát, whereas I think the Rubáiyát was, if anything, more influential on mainstream American literary culture than the haiku was. But we'll see if we can rekindle that interest.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Wendy. Anyone else who has a question? Okay, David has a question. Okay, go ahead, David.
Hi. I wonder if there's any connection of the writings of the Rubáiyát with more modern Iranian poets like Farrukhzad, and that sort of that liveliness. I don't know what the right word would be. And then actually more of a general thought that poetry seems to be, aside from Islam, a lifeblood of Persians. And might we Americans gain something from that?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I certainly have to say that it's enriched my life as an American. I grew up loving poetry and in English and French, and when I discovered Persian poetry, I just fell head over heels in love. And I also, you know, hung around with a lot of Iranians and noticed that, you know, if you're at a party and conversation goes in a certain direction, they'll just pull out this apposite verse, and it's because they've memorized hundreds, if not thousands of them. And so they're able to do that, and it still lives for them. And so I think that is something that American culture has lost to some extent. Of course, poetry hasn't disappeared, but maybe it doesn't bulk as large in our lives as it does in the lives of Iranians. And I agree with you entirely about that. I think that for modern Iran, the Rubáiyát genre has been important, as you say. Not necessarily, people don't necessarily write a lot of Rubáiyát, but they bring these attitudes of the unconventional attitudes that are in some of this Khayyami poetry into their work. You may know that Sadiq Hidayat, the great short story writer and philosopher, did an edition of Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, which he selected the ones that sounded to him as though they might have originally been written by Khayyam. And he made a very small selection. I can't remember, it was something like 80 or something. And so he cut out a lot of the medieval accretions. And, you know, he was a kind of existentialist, and he had a tendency towards Buddhism as part of his Iranian nationalism. He wanted to revive the old Buddhist culture of Khorasan of pre-Islamic times, and Khayyam was important to him in his existentialist and modernist work. And I also think it shouldn't be ignored that the poetry is enormously influential in modern Hindi and Urdu literature, because Indians and Pakistanis, at least of previous generations, typically knew Persian and even wrote in it, as with Iqbal or Ghalib. And they read the Rubaiyat. There are loads of manuscripts of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam throughout India. And so, you know, there are modern Urdu poets who I think have been deeply influenced by this verse and bring some of these tropes into their work. And from them, because it was the Urdu poets that were first hired as screenwriters in Bollywood in the 30s, a lot of Khayyami themes have gone into Indian cinema. So I think that, you know, that's a whole different book, but I think you could write a world literature impact of this poetry.
Thank you.
I guess we have time for one more question. If anyone has any, just raise your hand. Okay, Maddie has.
I have one if nobody else does, and then oh, Maddie, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Let's go with Maddie, and then, yeah, then you can ask the question. Maddie, go ahead. Can you, Maddie?
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, Jeremy, if you have a question, I can.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say a few words at the end. So.
Okay. So my only question is, do you think there is any symbolism that should be provided by the book? Like, do you think it can relate directly with the reader, or it needs some key and keywords to open the poems?
So my theory of this poetry is that it's actually quite direct, and it has a refreshing frankness to it. There is a tendency amongst some analyzers of the poetry to want to read it, as I mentioned, as Sufi poetry or as symbolic. I mean, it has symbols, obviously, as all good poetry does. But I think the thing that attracted me about it is that it's very frank and straightforward. And that's why I thought maybe the Victorian style, which is very elusive, isn't the right one to translate it into. So no, I think the poetry is quite accessible. And, you know, it's about feelings. It's about everyday life. I I feel like I need the touch of a lover. I need a good glass of wine to get through the day. It seems to me very much that kind of immediate experience that it's purveying. And I don't think you need any special key into it.
Sure, and it was, as you said, I think your theory is that it was more like an underground movement that they used name of Khayyam because he was strong, just to collect all these things together, like which happened by time. This is, I think,
my theory is that he was what we call a frame author. You know, it's like in the 1001 Nights in Arabic, all those stories are attributed to Scheherazade, and she becomes the frame author. But we know some were written in Cairo, some were written in Aleppo, some are actually originally maybe Sanskrit or Persian, and then they were put into Arabic. But Scheherazade becomes the frame author for this collection of diverse stories. I think the same thing happened with this kind of skeptical quatrains. If you were a poet in Shiraz in the 1300s, and you had some ideas that you wanted to express in this way, you might, say, look at this old poem I found by Khayyam. The other thing is, I think sometimes these sentiments were dangerous because occasionally there were changes of dynasty, and the new king was more religious than the old king. And if you had written a lot of poetry about wine and lovers, and the new king came in and was more Puritan, you could get into trouble. So I think for poetry that, some of this poetry says that there is no heaven or hell. Well, there were lots of clerics who would charge you with heresy for that and put you in jail. So much better that you found this poem by that old astronomer, Omar Khayyam, that says that there's no heaven or hell. So I think it can be also a way of expressing unwelcome truths in a society that has conventions and norms that tell against that.
Yep. Thank you. Khayli mamnoon.
Well, in the few minutes we have left, first of all, I want to thank you very, very much for participating, for joining us today. And the other thing that I maybe should have mentioned in the introduction, I think some of this has come out in everything that you said, is one of the reasons we wanted to have you as part of our Iranian Culture Festival is because poetry is so important a part of Iranian culture. When I visited Iran, I visited the shrines of Sadi and Hafez in Shiraz and of Tahir Baba, who's a more obscure poet, in Hamadan. And they're pilgrimage sites in a way that you can't imagine poets' graves being pilgrimage sites in the United States. And the men of my age that I've met, and I gather this is less true of the next generation, all the men I've met can recite poetry at length. So it's a very central part of the culture, and I hope it's something that people who participate in our festival go on to explore more. And again, thank you very, very much for agreeing to be with us today.
Well, it's my great pleasure. I made that same pilgrimage in Shiraz. The thing that struck me about Shirazis was how full of life they were. And you would see young men going down the sidewalk and they would be playing a flute. People were picnicking in the traffic islands. They would just go out and have a picnic there in the green. And it just seemed like still, even at that time, a very lively culture.
Well, thanks again, and thanks to everyone who joined us today. Does anybody else have any final words?
Yep. Thank you everyone for joining us. You can go again to our website, www.twin-cities-iranian-culture-festival.com. The recording of this talk will be there, so you can go and watch it later if you would like it. Okay.
Khuda Hafiz.
Khuda Hafiz.